A billionaire CEO takes a much-needed vacation after 10 years of non-stop hard work. But when he gets to the luxury resort where he hasn't been in a decade, he freezes in shock when he notices a pair of twin boys that look just like him. The private jet descended smoothly onto the sunlit island airstrip, its polished silver fuselage gleaming against the turquoise waters below. Alexander Harrington sat stiffly in his leather seat, his sharp gray suit immaculate despite the tropical heat he'd been warned about. His assistant, Claire, had all but begged him to leave the suit behind. "Relax for once, Mr. Harrington," she'd said with a mixture of exasperation and hope. Relaxation was not a word Alexander understood. The island was breathtaking in a way that might have stirred something in him a decade ago. Palm trees swayed lazily in the breeze, and the ocean stretched endlessly, the color of rare gemstones. But to him, it was merely a backdrop for the inconvenience he'd been coerced into enduring. His doctor's warnings about skyrocketing blood pressure and the thinly veiled intervention by his board members had been enough to force his hand. He stepped out of the jet, the humid air wrapping around him like an unwelcome embrace. A sleek black car waited to whisk him to the resort, and within minutes, he was seated in the sprawling open-air lobby, its vaulted ceilings and cascading greenery exuding opulence. The staff greeted him with polished smiles and deferential tones, offering cocktails and cold towels. He declined both. Alexander Harrington was not here to sip Mai Tais by the pool or indulge in beachside yoga sessions. This was a forced exile, a calculated pause in a life that thrived on precision and momentum. He had no intention of enjoying it. As he was escorted to his villa, his gaze swept across the manicured resort grounds, noting the infinity pool glistening in the sun, the cluster of hammocks strung between palm trees, and the cheerful vacationers scattered about. He registered it all with detached disinterest until something peculiar caught his eye. Two boys, no more than 10 years old, darted across the beach just beyond the pool area. They were laughing, their faces lit with the kind of unrestrained joy that only children seem to possess. What froze Alexander mid-step was their uncanny resemblance to himself as a boy. He narrowed his eyes, scrutinizing the pair from the shaded path where he stood. Both had dark, tousled hair, the same shade that used to fall across his own forehead before it turned a dignified silver. Their angular jawlines and sharp cheekbones mirrored the face he saw in photographs of his youth. Even their mannerisms, the way one boy shoved his hands into his pockets while the other gestured animatedly, seemed eerily familiar. "Is everything all right, sir?" the concierge asked, pausing with the keycard poised above the villa door. Alexander blinked, realizing he'd stopped walking. "Fine," he said curtly, turning his attention back to the villa. "Let's continue." Inside, the accommodations were as lavish as one would expect from the resort's price tag. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the ocean, the decor was an elegant blend of modern and tropical, and a chilled bottle of champagne sat waiting on the marble countertop. None of it impressed him. After dismissing the concierge, he found himself standing by the glass doors leading to the private pool. The boys were out of sight now, but their image lingered in his mind. He shook his head, dismissing the thought as absurd. Children bearing a passing resemblance to him was hardly a phenomenon worth pondering. He had no family ties, no relatives who might vacation here. He'd made certain of that. Alexander threw himself into his usual routine, albeit in a tropical setting, reviewing reports on his tablet, fielding calls from his executives, and making meticulous notes for an upcoming merger. By the time he allowed himself to glance at the clock, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the villa. The quiet outside was almost unsettling. He stood by the windows again, his gaze trailing to the beach where the boys had been earlier. To his surprise, they were back, this time sitting cross-legged on the sand, building what appeared to be a lopsided sandcastle. Their laughter carried faintly through the glass. Alexander's chest tightened unexpectedly. It wasn't nostalgia. He hadn't been a carefree child himself, and his memories of childhood were more defined by discipline and duty than joy. Yet something about their presence stirred a faint ache he couldn't place. He shook himself from his thoughts and turned back to his desk. But the image of the boys lingered, stubborn and intrusive, as though trying to claw its way into his carefully guarded mind. The next morning, Alexander set out to walk the resort grounds. It wasn't a decision born of leisure but rather a restlessness that he couldn't explain. He avoided the pool and cabanas, gravitating instead toward the quieter corners of the property. The beach stretched before him, nearly empty at this early hour, save for the two boys darting in and out of the waves, their laughter echoing against the morning calm. As he approached, their voices became clearer. They were debating something, whether their sandcastle from yesterday could withstand the incoming tide. One of them pointed emphatically at the structure, while the other mimicked the tone of a newscaster, declaring it a disaster waiting to happen. Alexander slowed his steps, watching from a distance. The boys hadn't noticed him yet, too engrossed in their playful argument. "What are you doing?" The younger one, by mere minutes he would later learn, asked his brother. "Reinforcing the walls," the older replied with a comical level of authority. "If you want something to last, you have to build it strong." Alexander felt a pang in his chest, a familiar phrase surfacing from a distant memory. His father had said those exact words to him once, long ago, during one of their rare bonding moments. The resemblance in both words and appearance was growing harder to dismiss. One of the boys looked up then, catching sight of Alexander standing a short distance away. His wide, curious eyes locked onto Alexander's, and a flicker of recognition seemed to pass between them. "Hi!" the boy called, unbothered by the stern-looking stranger. He waved enthusiastically before turning back to his brother. "Do you think he'd help us build the tower?" "Probably not," the other replied, barely glancing up. "He looks busy." Alexander's lips twitched, almost imperceptibly. Busy was an understatement for his life. And yet, he found himself rooted to the spot, unable to walk away from these two boys who had no idea how much they'd already unsettled his carefully ordered world. Alexander's steps lingered longer than he intended. The waves lapped gently at the shore, and the boys, oblivious to his turmoil, continued their sandcastle construction. Their carefree banter echoed in his ears long after he turned away and retreated to his villa. The striking resemblance nagged at him like a tune he couldn't shake, a strange familiarity that refused to be ignored. He convinced himself it was nothing. Coincidences happened. Children sometimes bore uncanny likenesses to strangers. It didn't mean anything. And yet, as the days passed, Alexander found himself unable to avoid the twins. It seemed like fate, or something more intentional, kept crossing their paths. In the mornings, he'd see them at breakfast, the younger one meticulously picking the strawberries out of his fruit bowl, while the elder made faces to make his brother laugh. Midday, they'd race past him on the pathways, one always a few steps ahead, laughing in victory as the other shouted protests. Even during his brief moments of escape to the quiet lounges or private beaches, the boys were there, chasing each other, collecting shells, or concocting elaborate games involving driftwood swords. What struck Alexander most wasn't just their resemblance to him. It was their energy, their fearlessness. Unlike most people he encountered, they weren't intimidated by his stoic demeanor or his tailored suits. They treated him like anyone else, flashing gap-toothed smiles as if he were just another vacationer. One afternoon, as Alexander sat under the shade of a cabana near the pool, he spotted the boys again. This time, they were attempting to balance on paddle boards in the shallow end. It was a chaotic scene. Liam, the older one, was barking instructions like a drill sergeant, while Ethan tried to paddle while seated, only to wobble and tip them both over. Their shared laughter was infectious, though Alexander managed only the faintest of smiles. They noticed him sitting there. Liam nudged Ethan, and the two whispered conspicuously before making their way toward him, dripping wet and still laughing. "You should have seen it," Liam announced, hands on his hips as if reporting a grand triumph. "We almost stood up." "Almost," Ethan added, shaking water from his hair like a dog. "But someone," he pointed dramatically at his brother, "can't keep his balance." "Not true," Liam retorted. "You're the one who moved." Alexander raised an eyebrow, unsure how he'd been pulled into this conversation. "Paddle boarding requires coordination," he said, his tone dry. Perhaps that's something you both lack. Liam grinned, unoffended. Maybe. But we're practicing. You should try. It's fun. I'll pass, Alexander replied, though he was faintly amused by the invitation. Ethan tilted his head, studying him with wide eyes. You don't do fun stuff, do you? The bluntness caught Alexander off guard. Most people tiptoed around him, carefully crafting their words. These boys, it seemed, had no such inhibitions. I do plenty of productive things, Alexander said, sidestepping the question. Fun is subjective. Sounds boring, Ethan said with a shrug, turning back toward the pool. Come on, Liam. Let's see if we can actually stand up this time. As they ran off, Alexander's gaze lingered on them. He hadn't expected to feel drawn to them. It wasn't just their appearance or their boldness. It was something deeper, something he couldn't name. That evening, as he sat at the resort's restaurant overlooking the water, he spotted them again. This time, they weren't playing. They were seated at a table near the bar, sharing a large bowl of pasta and whispering conspiratorially over their meal. A woman approached their table, a staff member in the resort uniform, her dark hair pulled into a loose bun. She leaned down, kissed the top of Ethan's head, and murmured something that made both boys laugh. Alexander's grip on his wine glass tightened. There was something familiar about her, though he couldn't place it from this distance. She moved with ease, balancing trays and exchanging smiles with guests. When she turned slightly, and the light caught her face, Alexander froze. It couldn't be. Her name surfaced from the depths of his memory, Maya. He hadn't seen her in over a decade, but there was no mistaking it. She was the bartender he'd met here years ago, the one he'd spent an unforgettable summer with before his ambition pulled him back to his world of skyscrapers and boardrooms. A sudden, inexplicable tension coiled in his chest. His eyes darted back to the boys. Ethan and Liam. His mind raced, calculating the years, the timing, the impossible coincidences. The next day, the twins found him again, this time lounging on a bench near the tennis courts. He wasn't trying to avoid them anymore. On some level, he was beginning to expect their interruptions. You again, Alexander greeted, folding the financial report in his lap. Don't you have better things to do than harass strangers? Ethan plopped onto the bench beside him, ignoring the comment entirely. Do you live in a big house? Alexander blinked. Yes. How big? Big enough. Do you have a family? Ethan's next question was direct, his voice casual yet curious. For a man who negotiated billion-dollar deals, Alexander found himself uncharacteristically off balance. No, he said after a pause. I don't. Why not? Ethan pressed, tilting his head. Because I chose a different path, Alexander replied, his tone edged with finality. Liam, who had been leaning against the armrest, jumped in. Our mom says family is the most important thing. Does she? Alexander asked, his voice softening despite himself. Yeah, Liam said proudly. She takes care of us all by herself. She works here. She's the best. Ethan nodded enthusiastically. She doesn't talk about our dad, though. Says he's not worth it. Alexander's breath hitched imperceptibly, but he forced his face to remain impassive. I see. Ethan glanced at him, then grinned as if he'd shared a great secret. You remind me of him. I bet he was serious like you. Alexander didn't respond. He couldn't. Instead, he watched as the boys darted off again, leaving him alone with thoughts that were growing increasingly difficult to ignore. For the first time in years, Alexander felt unmoored. His meticulously constructed world, so neatly ordered and predictable, was beginning to tilt. The boy's words echoed in his mind, stirring questions he wasn't ready to answer. Could it be possible? The resemblance, Maya's presence, and the timing, could it all mean what he feared and, in some strange way, hoped? He sat there long after the boys disappeared from view, staring at the horizon as the sun dipped lower in the sky. His carefully guarded world felt smaller now, and for the first time, Alexander Harrington didn't know what to do next. The question lingered in Alexander's mind like an unwelcome guest. Could they really be mine? Ethan and Liam's faces, so strikingly similar to his own at their age, played on an endless loop in his thoughts. It was a puzzle he couldn't shake, and every interaction with them seemed to deepen the ache in his chest. He thought about Maya. He thought about the way she had leaned over the boys at dinner the night before, her touch gentle but firm, her expression full of love. She hadn't noticed him sitting across the lounge, but he had seen enough to confirm what his instincts were already screaming. This was no coincidence. That evening, Alexander found himself seated at the resort's lounge, nursing a whiskey he barely tasted. The polished wood bar stretched before him, illuminated by the warm glow of pendant lights. Laughter and the soft hum of conversation filled the space, but Alexander's focus was elsewhere. The lounge hadn't changed much since the last time he was here. 11 years ago, he had spent endless summer nights in this very spot. It was where he had first met Maya. She had been standing behind the bar, pouring drinks with an effortless grace that had drawn him in immediately. She wasn't like anyone he'd met before, sharp, funny, and completely uninterested in the usual charm he relied on. He remembered how they talked for hours after her shift, sitting on the beach and sharing stories. She'd been a dreamer, full of plans to leave the island and see the world. He'd been a man on the cusp of greatness, so consumed by his ambitions that he hadn't realized the cost of his choices until it was too late. And then, just like that, he had left. No goodbye. No explanation. He had told himself it was for the best, that she would understand. But sitting here now, all these years later, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a mistake. The sound of glasses clinking behind the bar pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up, and there she was. Maya. She was moving quickly, her hair tucked into a loose bun, her hands deft as she mixed drinks and slid them across the bar with practiced ease. She looked older but no less radiant. Her eyes still carried the same spark, though there was a weariness to her now that hadn't been there before. Alexander's breath caught. For a moment, he considered leaving. What could he possibly say to her after all this time? But then she glanced up, her gaze sweeping across the lounge. Their eyes met and she froze. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Alexander saw the recognition in her expression, followed quickly by something else, shock, anger, maybe even a trace of sadness. She broke the stare first, turning back to the row of bottles behind her, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. He stood, his drink forgotten, and walked to the bar. "Maya," he said softly when he was close enough. She turned slowly, her face carefully neutral. "Alexander." Her voice was steady, but he could hear the edge beneath it. "I didn't expect to see you here. I didn't expect to be here," he admitted. "But now that I'm glad to see you." Her eyes narrowed slightly, and she let out a humorless laugh. "Glad to see me? That's rich, coming from you." The weight of her words hit him like a punch, but he couldn't blame her. He'd earned her bitterness. "I know I have no right to say that," he said quietly. "But it's the truth." "What are you doing here, Alexander?" she asked, crossing her arms. "Business retreat? Trying to close another deal?" "No," he said. "This isn't about work. I was told I needed a break, so here I am." "Lucky you," she replied, her tone sharp. "Some of us don't get to take breaks." His gaze flickered to the boys sitting at a table nearby, engrossed in a card game. He hesitated before speaking again. "Maya, those boys. Ethan and Liam. There, don't..." She cut him off, her voice low but firm. "Not here." The unspoken truth hung heavily between them. He nodded, stepping back, and returned to his table. But he couldn't leave it at that. Later that night, after the lounge had cleared out and the resort had grown quiet, Alexander found himself pacing the length of his villa. He couldn't stop replaying their interaction, couldn't ignore the way she had looked at him, equal parts wary and hurt. He hadn't intended to confront her like that, but the words had slipped out before he could stop them. Everything was beginning to make sense now, the boy's resemblance to him, the way Maya had avoided discussing their father, the timing of it all. He thought back to their summer together, to the nights spent talking about everything and nothing, to the way she had smiled at him like she could see straight through his carefully constructed facade. And then he thought about how he had left, how he had chosen his career over her without a second thought. He had told himself it was for the best, that she deserved someone who could give her the kind of stability he couldn't. But now, seeing her again, seeing those boys. He poured himself another drink, though it did little to steady his nerves. The realization was impossible to ignore now. Ethan and Liam weren't just familiar. They weren't just a coincidence. They were his sons. The thought left him breathless. He had spent his entire life avoiding attachments, convincing himself that his work was enough, that he didn't need a family. And yet here they were, two boys who had been growing up without him, who had no idea he existed. The guilt was overwhelming. He thought of Maya, raising them on her own, working tirelessly at the resort to provide for them. She had tried to shield them from the pain of his absence, and he had made that absence inevitable by walking away. Alexander didn't know what to do next. He wasn't the kind of man who apologized easily, and even if he could find the words, he wasn't sure Maya would, or should, accept them. But one thing was clear, he couldn't leave this unresolved. For the first time in his life, Alexander Harrington felt utterly lost. And for the first time, he wasn't sure he wanted to find his way back to the life he'd left behind. The following morning, Alexander woke early, the restless energy from the previous night still coursing through him. He spent hours pacing the length of his villa, going over every possible way to approach Maya. None of his imagined conversations seemed right. What did one even say to a woman they had abandoned, who had raised children alone because of that abandonment? By the time the sun was high in the sky, he decided to stop rehearsing and just go. He had never been a man to second-guess himself, and he wasn't about to start now. The resort was bustling with activity, but Alexander spotted Maya near the pool bar, setting up for the midday rush. Her uniform was crisp, and her movements were precise, but he could see the exhaustion in the tight line of her shoulders. For a moment, he considered walking away, giving her the peace she undoubtedly deserved. But then he thought of Ethan and Liam, of their laughter, their boldness, their familiarity, and he knew he couldn't leave this unfinished. "Maya," he said softly as he approached the bar. She turned sharply, her expression guarded. "Alexander." Her tone wasn't welcoming, but it wasn't outright dismissive either. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low. "I'm working," she replied, glancing around at the gathering crowd. "After your shift, then," he said. "Please." Maya sighed, her fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. "Fine. Meet me by the staff cottages at 8. But only because I don't want you doing this here." He nodded, grateful for the small concession, and walked away. The hours that followed felt interminable, but when the time came, Alexander made his way to the designated spot. The staff cottages were tucked away on the edge of the resort, surrounded by lush greenery. It was quiet here, the sounds of the ocean faint in the distance. Maya was waiting, leaning against the wooden railing of her porch. She had changed out of her uniform into a simple sundress, but her expression was just as guarded as before. "Say what you need to say," she said, crossing her arms. Alexander hesitated. For the first time in years, words failed him. He had stood in boardrooms filled with the most powerful people in the world and never faltered, but now, faced with Maya, he felt like a man out of his depth. "I owe you an apology," he began, his voice unsteady. "For leaving the way I did. For not being there when you needed me." Maya's eyes narrowed. "That's it? An apology? After all these years?" "No," he said quickly. "There's more. I need to know, are they mine?" Her jaw tightened, and she looked away, her silence more damning than any words. Finally, she exhaled and met his gaze. "Yes, Alexander. They're your sons." The confirmation hit him like a physical blow, even though he had already known it in his heart. He struggled to steady his breathing, his mind racing with 1,000 questions he didn't know how to ask. Why didn't you tell me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I tried, Maya said, her tone sharp. I called your office after I found out I was pregnant. I wrote letters. I even showed up once. But your assistants made it very clear that I wasn't welcome. They said you were too busy to deal with complications. Alexander winced, the words cutting deeper than he expected. He had always trusted his staff to handle things efficiently, to shield him from distractions. He hadn't realized the cost of that trust until now. I didn't know, he said. If I had, you would have what? Maya interrupted, her eyes flashing with anger. Dropped everything and come running? Don't lie to yourself, Alexander. You were so focused on building your empire that nothing else mattered. And honestly, I wasn't going to let my boys grow up feeling like an afterthought. Her words stung, but he couldn't argue with them. She was right. Back then, he had been consumed by his ambition, convinced that success required sacrifice. He had told himself it was worth it, but now, standing here, he wasn't so sure. I'm sorry, he said again, his voice thick with regret. For everything. Maya's expression softened slightly, though her guard didn't drop entirely. Sorry doesn't change the past. But if you're here to make amends, you need to understand something. Those boys are my entire world. I've done everything I can to give them a good life. I won't let anyone, especially you, hurt them. I don't want to hurt them, Alexander said. I want to know them. If you'll let me. Maya studied him for a long moment, her gaze searching his face for any sign of insincerity. Finally, she nodded. We'll see. But you're on my terms, Alexander. If you want to be part of their lives, you're going to have to prove that you're serious. I will, he promised. Whatever it takes. They stood there in silence, the weight of their shared history hanging heavily between them. For the first time in years, Alexander felt something other than control, something other than certainty. He felt vulnerable, and oddly enough, it felt like the first honest thing he'd felt in a very long time. Maya sighed, running a hand through her hair. I'll talk to them tomorrow. But don't expect miracles, Alexander. They don't know you, and they've never needed to. I understand, he said. And thank you? Maya nodded, her expression unreadable, and stepped back toward her cottage. Alexander watched her go, his heart heavier than it had been in years. He had come here searching for answers, but now that he had them, he wasn't sure what to do with them. All he knew was that he couldn't walk away again. Not this time. He turned and walked back toward his villa, the moonlight casting long shadows on the path ahead. For the first time, the future felt uncertain, but as daunting as it was, Alexander felt a strange sense of resolve. This time, he wouldn't let his fear or his pride dictate his choices. This time, he would stay. Alexander didn't sleep much that night. His mind was a storm of emotions, regret, guilt, anger, all swirling together in a relentless cycle. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Ethan and Liam, their bright smiles, their easy laughter. And then he saw Maya, the pain in her eyes as she spoke about her unanswered attempts to reach him. He had prided himself on being a man in control, but now, for the first time in years, he felt powerless. Morning arrived with a golden light that filtered through the villa's windows, and Alexander found himself staring at the horizon, his coffee untouched. He had made his choice. He wouldn't walk away. But staying meant facing the consequences of his absence, both with the boys and with Maya. By mid-morning, Maya approached him near the pool. She looked tired, as if the weight of their conversation had worn her down. Still, her shoulders were squared, and her gaze was steady. I talked to the boys, she said without preamble. Alexander's heart quickened. And? I told them you're an old friend of mine, she said carefully, emphasizing the last words. That you'll be around for a little while and that you wanted to get to know them. He nodded, understanding the caution in her voice. Thank you, Maya. I'm trusting you, Alexander, she said, her tone firm. But this isn't about you proving something to me. It's about them. If you hurt them, if you even think about walking away again, I will never forgive you. I won't, he said, his voice resolute. I promise. That afternoon, he found Ethan and Liam near the beach, engrossed in another elaborate game. They had fashioned a makeshift fort out of driftwood, and were arguing about how to improve its defenses. Looks sturdy, Alexander said as he approached, trying to keep his tone light. Ethan turned, squinting up at him. It's not. Liam wants to use seaweed for the roof, and that's a terrible idea. It's not a terrible idea, Liam shot back. It's waterproof. Barely, Ethan countered. Alexander crouched down, inspecting their handiwork. What if you used palm leaves instead? They're lighter and more durable. Both boys paused, considering the suggestion. Then Liam grinned. See? He gets it. Ethan rolled his eyes but smiled too. Fine. Palm leaves. But you're helping. The hours slipped by as Alexander worked alongside them, gathering palm leaves and reinforcing their fort. The boy's energy was infectious, and he found himself smiling more than he had in years. They peppered him with questions about where he was from, what he did, and why he was staying at the resort. I work in business, Alexander explained vaguely when Liam asked. It keeps me busy. Too busy for fun stuff? Ethan asked, his earlier observations still fresh in his mind. Alexander hesitated, the weight of the question sinking in. Sometimes, he admitted. But I'm trying to change that. Good, Ethan said with a nod, as if he were the authority on such matters. When Maya came to collect them for dinner, she found the three of them sitting inside the completed fort, laughing as Ethan tried to scare them with exaggerated ghost stories. Her expression softened slightly, but her guard didn't drop entirely. Boys, it's time to go, she called. 5 more minutes, Liam pleaded. No, Maya said, though her tone wasn't harsh. The boys scrambled out of the fort, saying quick goodbyes to Alexander before running to their mother. As they walked away, Maya glanced back at him. Her eyes held a mixture of gratitude and wariness, a silent reminder of the boundaries she had set. Over the next few days, Alexander found himself spending more and more time with the twins. They invited him into their world with a casual ease that both warmed and unnerved him. They didn't know the truth yet, but their openness and trust made the weight of his secret even heavier. He taught them how to play chess, his strategic mind enjoying the challenge of explaining complex moves to 2 curious but impatient boys. He joined them on their treasure hunts along the beach, listening as they crafted wild stories about pirates and hidden gold. Each interaction chipped away at the walls he had built around himself, and he found himself growing increasingly attached. But with every moment of joy came an equal measure of guilt. He couldn't stop thinking about all the milestones he had missed, their first words, their first steps, the birthdays and holidays he hadn't been there for. He was a stranger to them, but they were quickly becoming everything to him. One evening, as they sat on the beach watching the sunset, Ethan turned to him with a thoughtful expression. You're different, he said. Alexander raised an eyebrow. Different how? I don't know, Ethan said, shrugging. Most adults don't want to hang out with us. But you're not boring. Well, I'll take that as a compliment, Alexander said with a small smile. Are you going to be here forever? Liam asked, his tone casual but his eyes hopeful. The question caught Alexander off guard. He looked at them, their faces illuminated by the fading light, and felt the ache in his chest grow. I don't know about forever, he said carefully, but I'll be here for a while. The boys seemed satisfied with that answer, but the conversation lingered in Alexander's mind long after they had gone inside. He knew he couldn't keep the truth from them forever, but he also knew that revealing it would change everything. Later that night, he found Maya at the bar, cleaning up after a long day. She looked up as he approached, her expression cautious. They're incredible, he said, his voice quiet. They are, she agreed. And they're also mine to protect. I know, he said. And I'm grateful you've let me spend time with them. But I can't keep pretending to be a family friend. They deserve to know the truth. Maya sighed, setting down the glass she was holding. You're right. But this has to be done carefully. They're just kids, Alexander. They've built their world around the life I've given them. You showing up, us telling them who you are, that's going to shake everything. I don't want to hurt them, he said. I just want to be part of their lives. Then we'll figure it out, she said, though her voice was heavy with uncertainty. But it's going to take time. Alexander nodded, his resolve hardening. He had already missed too much, but he wouldn't miss any more. Whatever it took, he would prove to Maya, and to the boys, that he wasn't going anywhere. The days that followed were a mix of quiet revelations and moments of unrestrained laughter. Alexander had always thought of himself as a man apart, someone whose purpose was defined by what he built, not who he connected with. But now, with Ethan and Liam, everything he believed about himself began to unravel. The twins were relentless in their energy and unfiltered honesty. They didn't care about his success or his carefully curated image. To them, he was just Alexander, the guy who knew how to outmaneuver them in chess and who didn't mind getting his hands dirty building sandcastles. One afternoon, they dragged him to the edge of the resort, where the jungle gave way to a hidden cove. It was their secret base, they explained, filled with treasures like smooth stones, bits of sea glass, and driftwood shaped like swords. Ethan handed Alexander a stick and declared it his official weapon for the day. You're the captain, Ethan announced. Because you look like one. Captain of what, exactly? Alexander asked, holding the driftwood skeptically. Of the pirates, obviously, Liam said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. We're raiding the other side of the island. Alexander raised an eyebrow. And what are we looking for? Gold, Ethan said with a grin. Or maybe coconuts. Whichever we find first. For hours, they explored the cove, waging imaginary battles and scavenging for treasures. Alexander found himself laughing more than he had in years, the tension in his chest loosening with every moment. He didn't care that he looked ridiculous or that his polished shoes were now caked in sand. For the first time in a long time, he felt free. That evening, as the boys slept soundly in their room, Maya approached him outside her cottage. She leaned against the railing, her expression softer than it had been in weeks. They adore you, she said, her voice quiet. Alexander turned to her, his gaze steady. They're remarkable boys. That's because of you. Maya gave him a faint smile, though there was still a shadow of doubt in her eyes. I didn't do it alone. I had to lean on people here, friends, coworkers. But I tried to give them the best life I could. You've done more than that, Alexander said. You've raised them to be kind and curious and brave. I see it in everything they do. Maya looked at him, her eyes searching his face. And you? What do you see when you look at yourself now? The question caught him off guard. He hesitated, unsure of how to answer. I see someone who's trying, he said finally. Someone who's realized that building skyscrapers and empires doesn't mean much if there's no one to share it with. Maya didn't respond right away, but her silence wasn't cold. Instead, it felt like she was letting his words sink in, deciding whether or not to trust them. She nodded once and turned to go inside, leaving Alexander to his thoughts. The next day, Alexander found himself sitting at a chessboard with Liam while Ethan narrated the game like a sports commentator. The boys were quick learners, and Liam in particular had a knack for spotting openings that Alexander hadn't expected. You're getting good, Alexander said as Liam moved his knight into position. I learned from the best, Liam replied with a sly grin. Ethan leaned over, his face close to Alexander's. What's the best thing you ever did? Like, your coolest moment? Alexander leaned back, considering the question. That's a tough one, he said, his tone thoughtful. But I think it's yet to happen. The boys exchanged confused looks. What do you mean? Ethan asked. I mean, sometimes the best things in life aren't about what you've done, but what you're going to do next, Alexander said. And I think my best moments will involve spending more time with you too. Liam's grin widened, and Ethan gave him an exaggerated thumbs up. Good answer, Ethan said. Later, as the sun dipped low in the sky, painting the horizon in hues of gold and orange, the twins dragged Alexander to the beach to watch the sunset. They sat in the sand, shoulders brushing as the waves lapped gently at the shore. "What do you want to do when you grow up?" Alexander asked them, breaking the companionable silence. "I want to be an explorer," Ethan said immediately. "Like the kind who finds lost cities and hidden treasure." "And you, Liam?" Alexander asked. Liam hesitated, then shrugged. "I don't know yet. Maybe an inventor. Or maybe I'll build boats and sail around the world." "Both sound like incredible plans," Alexander said. "You don't have to know right now. You've got plenty of time to figure it out." Ethan leaned back on his hands, gazing at the horizon. "What about you? Did you always know what you wanted to do?" "Yes," Alexander admitted. "But I think I focused so much on that one thing that I missed out on a lot of others." "Like what?" Liam asked. "Like this," Alexander said, gesturing to the beach around them. "Moments like this." Ethan tilted his head. "Well, you're here now. That's what matters, right?" Alexander's throat tightened, and he nodded. "Right," he said softly. As the days stretched into weeks, Alexander began to see the world through new eyes. The things that had once seemed so important, deals, profits, accolades, now felt hollow in comparison to the laughter of the twins or the quiet conversations with Maya. One evening, as he sat on the porch of his villa, Alexander found himself looking at his phone. There were dozens of missed calls and unread emails from his staff, all demanding his attention. For the first time, he didn't feel the pull to answer them. Instead, he turned the phone off and stared out at the ocean, letting the sound of the waves wash over him. He thought about everything he had built, all the sacrifices he had made to climb to the top. And he thought about what he had missed along the way, relationships, family, a sense of belonging. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a different kind of future, one that wasn't defined by his work but by the people he cared about. The emptiness he had carried for so long didn't feel so heavy anymore. He still had a long way to go, but for the first time, Alexander Harrington felt like he was on the right path. The days had settled into a rhythm, adventures with Ethan and Liam, quiet talks with Maya, and evenings spent watching the sunset alone. Alexander knew this fragile peace couldn't last forever. The truth, hovering over every interaction, grew heavier with each passing moment. He'd spent so much time building a bond with the boys that the idea of shattering their perception of him felt unbearable. Yet he also knew that withholding the truth would only make things worse. One afternoon, the boys convinced him to join them on a small hike to a lookout point they called Pirate's Peak. It was a short climb through a shaded jungle trail, the air filled with the chatter of birds and the rustle of leaves. The boys raced ahead, their laughter echoing through the trees, but they always stopped to wait for him, their excitement infectious. At the top, the view was breathtaking. The ocean stretched out endlessly before them, its surface glittering under the sun. Ethan and Liam plopped down on a rocky ledge, sharing a bag of snacks they had brought along. Alexander sat beside them, the weight of what he was about to say pressing heavily on his chest. For a moment, he simply watched them. They were so carefree, so full of life. He envied that innocence, even as he prepared to disrupt it. "There's something I need to tell you," he began, his voice unusually soft. The boys looked up, their curiosity piqued. "What is it?" Liam asked, his brow furrowing slightly. Alexander hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "You know how I've been spending a lot of time with you two lately?" "Yeah," Ethan said with a grin. "You're like our honorary uncle or something." Alexander managed a small smile, though it quickly faded. "It's more than that," he said. "The truth is, I think I'm your father." The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. The boys stared at him, their expressions shifting from confusion to disbelief. "What?" Liam said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know until I came here," Alexander said quickly, trying to explain. "Your mother and we knew each other a long time ago. I left before I realized she was pregnant, and I didn't know about you until recently." Ethan's face twisted into a frown. Does Mom know you're saying this? She does, Alexander said. We've talked about it. She's the one who raised you, and she's done an incredible job. I'm not here to take anything away from her. I want to be part of your lives if you'll let me. The boys exchanged a look, their expressions unreadable. Liam was the first to speak. Why didn't you come sooner? If you're really our dad, why weren't you here before? Alexander's chest tightened. Because I didn't know, he said honestly. If I had, I would have come. I would have done things differently. Ethan crossed his arms, his gaze sharp. Mom doesn't talk about our dad. She always said we didn't need one. She was protecting you, Alexander said. And I can't blame her for that. But I'm here now, and I want to get to know you for real. The boys fell silent, their young faces a mixture of emotions too complex for their age. Finally, Liam stood and brushed off his shorts. We need to go, he said, his voice quiet but firm. Ethan followed, his expression unreadable. Neither of them said another word as they started back down the trail, leaving Alexander alone on the lookout point. When he returned to the resort, Maya was waiting for him outside his villa. Her arms were crossed, and her expression was a mix of anger and worry. They told me, she said before he could speak. Alexander nodded. I thought they deserved to hear it from me. They're confused, Alexander. They don't know what to do with this, Maya said, her voice tight. And honestly, neither do I. I couldn't keep lying to them, he said. They needed to know the truth. Maya shook her head, her frustration evident. The truth doesn't always make things better. You dropped this on them without thinking about how it would affect them, or me. We've built a life, Alexander. A simple, happy life. And now you're complicating everything. I'm not trying to complicate anything, he said, his voice rising slightly. I just want to be part of their lives. And what happens when you leave? Maya shot back. Because that's what people like you do, isn't it? You get what you want, and then you move on. I'm not leaving, he said firmly. Not this time. Maya's eyes softened, but her voice was still wary. You say that now. But how do I know you mean it? How do they know? Because I'm here, he said. And I'm not going anywhere. She stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she let out a long sigh and looked away. You have to be patient, Alexander. They're not just going to accept this overnight. And I need time too. I understand, he said quietly. But I'm not giving up on them, or on you. Maya's gaze flicked back to him, her eyes filled with a mix of emotions he couldn't quite decipher. Don't make promises you can't keep, she said softly before turning and walking away. Alexander watched her go, the weight of her words settling heavily on his shoulders. He knew he had shaken their world, disrupted the fragile balance Maya had worked so hard to create. But he also knew that staying silent would have been worse. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Alexander sat alone on the porch of his villa, the sound of the waves a distant hum. He had spent his life building an empire, but for the first time, he realized that true legacy wasn't measured in skyscrapers or bank accounts. It was measured in connections, in the people you loved and who loved you in return. He had taken the first step, but the road ahead was uncertain. All he could do now was keep walking, one step at a time, and hope that, in the end, it would be enough. The next few days were tense, the boys avoiding Alexander whenever possible. He gave them space, respecting their need to process the bombshell he dropped on them. Still, the silence was unbearable. He missed their laughter, their questions, the way they made him feel alive in a way he hadn't for years. Maya, too, was distant. She carried herself with the same poise she always had, but there was an added layer of guardedness now, as though she was bracing herself for the worst. Alexander tried not to take it personally, but he knew her apprehension wasn't unfounded. He had made mistakes that had cost them all years they could never get back. One evening, unable to take the tension any longer, Alexander sought her out. He found her at the bar, her shift just ending. She was stacking glasses when he approached, and she glanced at him briefly before returning to her task. Maya, he began softly. She didn't look up. What do you want, Alexander? To talk, he said. To apologize. That got her attention. She set down the glass she was holding and turned to face him, crossing her arms. I've heard apologies from you before, she said. What makes this one different? He took a deep breath, the weight of his words pressing down on him. Because I mean it this time, he said. Maya, I was selfish. I was so focused on my career, on building something bigger than myself, that I didn't stop to think about what I was leaving behind. I didn't just walk away from you. I walked away from a chance to be part of something real, something meaningful. Her expression softened slightly, though her eyes remained wary. And now? What's changed? Everything, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Meeting Ethan and Liam has made me realize just how empty my life has been. All the success, all the money, it doesn't mean anything without them. Without you. Maya looked away, her gaze falling to the bar. You can't just waltz back into our lives and expect everything to fall into place, she said. It doesn't work like that. I know, he said. And I'm not asking for forgiveness, not yet. All I'm asking for is a chance. A chance to prove that I can be the father they deserve and the man you can trust. She was silent for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the bar. Finally, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. The boys come first, she said firmly. Their happiness, their stability, that's what matters. If you're serious about this, you need to show them, not just say it. I will, he promised. Whatever it takes. The next morning, Alexander took his first step toward making good on that promise. He found the boys sitting by the pool, their legs dangling in the water. They looked up as he approached, their expressions wary but curious. Mind if I join you? He asked. They exchanged a look before shrugging in unison. Sure, Liam said. Alexander sat down, his shoes off, and let his feet dip into the cool water. For a while, they sat in silence, the tension between them palpable. Finally, Alexander spoke. I owe you both an apology, he said. For not being there, for not knowing about you sooner. I made a lot of mistakes, and I'm sorry for how those mistakes have affected you. Ethan frowned, his small hands gripping the edge of the pool. Why didn't you know? Because I wasn't paying attention to the things that mattered, Alexander admitted. I let work take over my life, and I didn't stop to think about the people I was leaving behind. That's on me, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. Liam looked at him, his expression thoughtful. Are you going to leave again? No, Alexander said firmly. I'm here to stay. If you'll let me. The boys didn't respond immediately, but the tension in their shoulders seemed to ease. After a moment, Ethan kicked at the water and muttered, We'll see. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Over the next few days, Alexander threw himself into being present. He joined the boys on their treasure hunts, cheered them on during their paddleboarding attempts, and even let them teach him the rules of a chaotic card game they'd invented. Slowly, their walls began to come down. Ethan's teasing grin returned, and Liam started asking questions again, his curiosity reignited. One afternoon, the three of them decided to build a sand castle. It started as a simple structure, but soon evolved into an elaborate fortress with towers, moats, and a shell-lined courtyard. Alexander let the boys take the lead, offering suggestions here and there but mostly marveling at their creativity. Maya appeared as they worked, her presence as steadying as the tide. She stood a short distance away, watching with an unreadable expression. Alexander glanced up and met her gaze, offering a tentative smile. To his surprise, she smiled back, a small but genuine gesture that filled him with a cautious sense of hope. Mom! Ethan called, waving her over. Come see! She walked over, her sandals sinking into the sand. Wow, she said, her tone impressed. This is incredible. It's a fortress. Liam explained, pointing out the various features. Alexander helped. Maya looked at Alexander, her smile lingering. It looks like a team effort. It was, Alexander said, his voice quiet but steady. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange, the four of them sat together on the beach, the completed sandcastle standing proudly before them. For the first time, Alexander felt a sense of belonging that had eluded him for most of his life. Maya leaned back on her hands, her gaze on the ocean. "You've surprised me," she said softly. Alexander turned to her, his expression earnest. "I'll keep surprising you," he said. "If you'll let me." She didn't respond immediately, but when she finally looked at him, her eyes held something he hadn't seen before: hope. "We'll take it one day at a time," she said. "For their sake." Alexander nodded, his heart lighter than it had been in years. One day at a time. As the stars began to dot the sky, the twins started planning their next big project, a sandcastle even bigger and better than this one. Their excitement was contagious, and Alexander found himself laughing, his voice blending with theirs in a way that felt natural and right. For the first time, Alexander Harrington wasn't thinking about his empire or his legacy. He wasn't thinking about what he had built or what he had lost. He was thinking about the present, about the people who mattered most, and about the endless possibilities that lay ahead. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a beginning. And for Alexander, that was more than enough. The days turned into weeks, and the tentative bond Alexander had forged with Maya and the boys grew stronger. His presence became a natural part of their daily lives, Ethan and Liam racing to his villa each morning to drag him into some new adventure, Maya softening with each shared glance or quiet conversation. One evening, as the sun cast golden light over the resort, Maya invited Alexander to dinner. It was a simple meal at her small cottage, with the boys chattering excitedly about their day. Alexander helped set the table, feeling oddly at home in the modest, cozy space. After dinner, while the boys worked on a puzzle in the corner, Maya joined Alexander on the porch. The night air was warm, the ocean a distant hum. She handed him a glass of wine and leaned against the railing, her expression thoughtful. "They adore you," she said, breaking the silence. "They're remarkable," he replied. "And they're yours. You've done an incredible job with them." Maya smiled faintly, looking out at the stars. "You're part of their lives now," she said. "I see it every day. They're happier. Lighter. I owe that to you," Alexander said, his voice quiet. "You gave them everything I couldn't." She turned to him, her gaze steady. "You're here now. That's what matters." Alexander hesitated before reaching for her hand. She didn't pull away, and the warmth of her touch sent a spark of hope through him. "I don't want to just be here for them, Maya. I want to be here for you too." Her eyes searched his face, her guard still partially raised but her heart beginning to soften. "I'm scared, Alexander," she admitted. "Scared you'll leave again. Scared this will hurt more than it helps." "I'm scared too," he said honestly. "But I've learned something being with you and the boys. Family isn't something you walk away from. It's something you fight for. And I'm ready to fight for this." Maya studied him for a long moment, then let out a soft laugh. "You always were good with words." "They're only words unless I prove them," he said. "And I will. One day at a time, if that's what it takes." She nodded, her smile growing. "Okay," she said. "One day at a time." The sound of tiny footsteps interrupted them, and they turned to see Ethan and Liam standing in the doorway, their faces lit with curiosity. "Are you guys holding hands?" Ethan asked, his grin wide. Maya rolled her eyes, but Alexander chuckled, pulling the boys onto the porch with him. "What do you think?" he teased. "I think it's weird," Liam said with a smirk, but his tone was playful. "Well, get used to it," Maya said, wrapping an arm around each boy. "Because we're a team now." Ethan grinned. "Does this mean you're staying forever?" Alexander looked at him, his heart swelling. Yes, he said. Forever. The boys whooped, dragging him and Maya into a group hug. Laughter filled the night air, mingling with the sound of the waves. For the first time, Alexander felt a sense of completeness he had never known. He had spent his life chasing success, but now, surrounded by Maya and the boys, he realized he had found something far more valuable: a family, a home, and a chance to build a future filled with love. As the waves gently lapped at the shore and the laughter of a newfound family echoed through the night, Alexander Harrington realized that his greatest success wasn't the empire he built but the connections he had fought to rebuild. His journey wasn't about fixing the past, it was about creating a future filled with love, trust, and the promise of something greater than himself. And that's the heart of this story: the power of redemption, the courage to confront mistakes, and the incredible joy that comes from choosing love over fear. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales that remind us of what truly matters. What would you do if faced with a moment like Alexander's? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to hit the bell so you never miss another story. Until next time, take care, and remember, sometimes, life's greatest treasures aren't the ones we seek but the ones we're brave enough to embrace.